Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Startup Sense podcast. This is your host, Jonah Lupton. It is a beautiful Friday here in Massachusetts. Actually, I kind of lied about that. It's raining. It's not that nice, but it's the summer, so I'll take it. Today's guest is Nikko Patten-Weinstein. He is the co-founder of a company called Sparkfund. He had four founders originally, or I guess there was four founders involved, so he had three co-founders. One is still involved. Two have since moved on, but they maintain good relationships. The company is based in Washington, D.C. They've raised close to $20 million across all their rounds. They did an $8 million round earlier this year. Looks like they have some pretty impressive investors on board. We'll talk about that soon. So Sparkfund, it's a little tricky. I'm going to have Nikko explain this better, but they are a financial technology company that is letting businesses pay for their energy products over time, or I guess actually in some cases even free, but I don't want to misspeak here. So let's welcome Nikko to the show, learn more about the company, talk about some other cool things. Nikko, how are you, man?
Doing well. Thanks, Jetta. Really appreciate having me on.
Oh, thank you so much. So before I put my foot in the mouth and misrepresent the company, why don't you tell us what Sparkfund does?
Yeah, sure thing. This has definitely been one of the challenges of this business is how do you describe it succinctly and quickly? But our goal maybe to start there is to really help businesses get better, efficient equipment at no risk into their spaces. We all know that LEDs and things like that are a good choice, but we have a hard time prioritizing them to spend the money on them because we're busy running our businesses. So what Sparkfund's trying to do is make that as easy as sort of other service type things we've gotten used to, like Amazon Web Services or say Netflix. So instead of having to use your cash to buy a bunch of LED lights that you need to make a bunch of equipment and technical choices about, we can work with other installers all across the country to come bring you the best solution that brings you the value you need, and you just get to pay a simply monthly payment for that. And in most cases, that actually ends up being less than that payment is less than what you save on energy. So it's not only better free stuff at no risk, but you're actually saving a little bit on your energy bill too.
So who is your target market here?
Yeah, and it's pretty broad. And that's been one of our challenges is picking where to narrow down first. But basically anyone with a building or even a tenant in a building that's a commercial or any sort of large organization is fair game. Maybe we've got dreams one day to do residential, but that's a long way off at this point.
And who do you guys typically go after? I mean, so say you narrow it down to a specific office building. Are you calling the owner of the building or the property management company? Or I mean, I'm not even sure. I mean, I've never had to call on office buildings before, but
Yeah.
who is the right person for you to speak with?
That's a great question. And it depends a lot on the type of organization. In smaller groups, we find that sometimes it's directly to the C-suite, the president or CEO. For large organizations that have a lot of locations, often there's like a facilities manager that is responsible for all those sites. So it really depends on the organization, but usually it's someone who's involved with sort of maintaining and operating the space that they work in.
Okay. And so on the website, you talk, man, I know in the intro or actually in the pre-call, you mentioned lighting. On the website, you guys talk about building controls and HVAC. I mean, how much money are we talking here? I mean, how much would an office building be investing into new equipment in any of those categories?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the average project that we see, particularly for LED lighting, is around 200,000, 300,000. And that can be a wide variety of spaces and different needs. We've seen everything from grow lights for like indoor urban farming to like a small mom and pop shop on Main Street. So it really runs the gambit. But for LEDs in particular, usually we see around a couple hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Okay. So who are you guys replacing in the market? What service is this replacing? Is this just, the hotel, the office building would go to a distributor or a wholesaler, or, I mean, I'm assuming they're not walking into Home Depot. So,
Yeah.
I mean, how would they, outfit or retrofit their place with lighting versus coming to you guys?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the nice things is that we're pretty aligned incentive-wise with the existing market. We're not trying to replace anyone. We're trying to increase the rate and accessibility that this type of grid edge tech is making its way out into the world. So right now, most people kind of wait until something breaks. Their boiler isn't working anymore or a light bulb goes out, and then they sort of look into what options they have to replace that and say, oh, cool, there's this way better tech that we can maybe use. So what we're trying to do is make that transition choice really easy to make in a proactive sense So instead of waiting for things to break and wear out over years and years, let's start swapping in the better stuff now, and we can all take a sort of slice of the benefit that brings.
Right. Okay, makes sense. And then how do you guys make money?
Yeah, great question. We're trying to make that simpler, but we have a sort of financing branch at the heart of the company. So we do make a little bit of money in terms of like how efficiently we can lend, but that's relatively small towards the sort of model that we're going to increasingly, which is to sort of share some margins with the partners that are actually doing direct install and servicing of that equipment. So Sparkfund just takes a little bit of the cut for sort of enabling all this to be possible.
Now, how did you get into this business? What were you doing before you started Sparkfund?
Yeah, personally, I never expected to start a company or be involved in financing, but I was always sort of a loudmouth about the environment and try to, being sustainable and conscious of how we interact with the world around us. But beforehand, I was actually working at a software company as an engineer at Intuit. So I was working on the QuickBase platform that Intuit had. And I met Pierre, our CEO, at a New Year's Eve party off the coast of Portland, Maine on an island.
Wait, which island? Don't say Drake's Island.
No, Shabig.
Oh, okay. I have a few friends that have summer houses up there on some of the different islands. Like you don't realize how many little islands are off the coast of Maine until you get up there and see them.
Yeah, there's a ton of them, and they're gorgeous. It's a
Yeah,
really
they are.
lovely place to go visit.
Some very, very private. Okay. And then how did you guys find the other two co-founders?
So Pure had actually already been working with them at a consultancy, a big sort of international one, ICF. And they had actually started a sort of consulting project internally there, doing something very similar, which is where they learned a lot of these lessons and sort of identified the opportunity. So they were, as consultants, helping large organizations compare and identify different energy efficiency projects that those orgs might do and benefit from. And they just saw how painful it was to try to do that and thought, hey, we can make this better. So the other three were sort of already in place and were working together and had like an initial sort of pitch deck in mind. And I asked them, hey, this sounds really cool. What are you doing for technology? To which Pierre's response was, yes, I like technology. So I figured I'd stick around and try to help out however I could.
You guys started working on this in 2013, but you weren't really doing any, projects until the next year, 2014. So from when you guys started working on this to when you were getting projects done, installed, what happened? I mean, what needed to go into that, those first few months or 6 months, whatever it was, to get the company to a point where you guys were ready to start selling?
Yeah, great question. A lot of it is that it turns out starting a fund and a financing business is a lot harder than it might seem from the outside. So a lot of that was lining up funding, understanding all the legal components, the paybacks, the sort of weighted average cost of capital, all the sort of finance calculations that need to go into that. So a lot of that was that process. But we were also still sort of figuring out exactly how to package the offering. As we sort of talked about at the beginning, it's a hard thing to articulate in the beginning. So trying to refine that articulation also took a bunch of time.
This is, a new financing model that's never existed before, right?
I mean, particularly in this space, there are definitely other folks trying to get to the same outcome of how can we proactively get this really productive grid edge tech out there. But to our knowledge, no one else is doing it quite like we are in terms of the contract structuring, the underlying financing, and all the sort of software and tooling that we're doing to try to make the transitions and connections as smooth as possible.
So there's definitely some education that has to go along with the sales.
Yeah, definitely. Because while in a lot of cases, as a society, we're getting really used to the idea of access, not ownership for things like movies, the Netflix example, we're
Right,
still
right.
trying to adjust and figure out how do we do that for physical things like hardware and lighting.
So you guys raised, just looking at Crunchbase right now, looks like you raised the seed round in early 2014. Does that sound right?
That sounds about right. Yeah.
Who did you guys raise that capital from?
The seed round was a combination of some friends and families, as is often the case, and then we were just incredibly fortunate with some really amazing angel investors. One of the nice things about working in the sort of energy efficiency space is that a lot of people are deeply committed to the mission of having an environmental impact for the positive. I think that there was a McKinsey report way back when, or something to that extent, and check my numbers, but I think it was saying that there is a massive reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that we could achieve just by taking advantage of the energy efficiency projects that we know exist just in the US.
Nice. Yeah, one of my new companies, or actually, I shouldn't say the company that I'm working on most recently, is focused on the same industries as you. We're not energy, we're soundproofing, but we're going after the hotels, the office buildings, and the apartment
Yeah.
complexes. So I've been doing a lot of research on those markets, and they're obviously enormous markets. I mean, that's no big surprise. But how are you guys now penetrating those markets? What is your sales strategy, your sales process?
Yeah, that's a great question. We kind of have three primary channels. Uh, the one that we've been doing the longest is actually partnering directly with the installers and the original equipment manufacturers who are already going out selling all this great tech that we know is so beneficial. We're trying to just sort of turbo boost the way that they can do that. So it's sort of their sales approach, additionally powered by Sparkfund, to make that offer to those customers all the more compelling. Because we're finding that, like you're saying, the folks running hotels and all these other businesses, they know that there's a benefit there. It's just not enough of a benefit for them to go through all the hassle on their own. So we're trying to make that effort level commensurate with the value they're getting out of it.
Gotcha. Okay. So 42 people, I believe you said, is the size of your current team. 25% of them are not in DC. Does that sound right?
Yeah, about that. I think we've got maybe 12 or 14 folks who are remote. Yeah.
Okay. Are the remote people mostly doing sales?
Actually, no, we have a couple that are sales, but a lot of it is the software development team. Our team uses a programming language called Clojure. So we've got a couple of them in North Carolina, the sort of Durham and the Technology Triangle area, which is a sort of a hot spot for Clojure. But we've got developers all the way in Canada, up in Vancouver, one up in Vermont, some in Boston. So they're sort of all over the place.
What's your reasoning for having developers all over the place instead of sitting, under the same roof?
Yeah, and this is sort of a question that I often find myself chatting with other founders and technical folks about. But particularly for the type of work that's involved for software, having that kind of space and quiet is actually often a really positive thing. So as long as you're making enough upfront efforts to make sure that they stay connected and really integrate with the rest of the company and the culture, having that separation can actually be a boost to their productivity.
And would you guys use Slack and Trello and some of those?
All the toys, yeah, definitely a lot of Slack. We use Zoom for our video sharing, which has been excellent. We've been using them since the very beginning, and having really high quality video chats and screen shares makes all the difference for remote work.
What did you guys use before Slack? Was it just email?
We actually used a combination of like Google Hangouts, and then I was experimenting with a whole bunch of other different messaging options. I even tried to pitch using some like IRC or ICQ or some of those older protocols. So I was delighted when Slack kind of hit the scene.
Yeah, they're crushing it. They're absolutely just crushing it.
Yeah.
I mean, there was rumors, I think Amazon maybe was trying to buy him for like 10 billion, and then they ended up making, I think, a strategic investment. I think it was Amazon, but yeah, they're obviously they're rolling. Um, in terms of sales then, so how do you guys have what's the sales team like? I assume it's a lot, three or four outside sales reps, and then maybe one or two inside people.
We've actually been growing the sales team a bunch, and we were really fortunate in bringing on a new executive to the team earlier this year, the beginning of this year, actually, Asher Berg, who we were lucky enough to convince to join us from Oracle, who acquired OPower, which is where Asher is at. So he's been building out this stellar sales team. Because historically we kind of had blended operations and sales, since actually installing some of these projects historically has been kind of complex. But
Yeah.
as a lot of our systems are coming into place and we're able to deliver on really simplifying the process, now we can separate to have more sales and then the deeper operations a little bit more behind the scenes.
How long is your sales cycle?
Yeah, we're trying to get it shorter and shorter, but for a lot of these projects, it still takes about 80 days from open to close. In some cases, we are definitely seeing that go way shorter with the sort of technology subscription approach, uh, but it's still a little bit longer than we'd like it to be.
How do you complement what the sales reps are doing on their end, or generating, leads for them? Do you guys do conferences, trade shows, any other type of online advertising? I mean, obviously, this doesn't sound like the kind of company where Facebook ads would be very, very productive.
Yeah, you're exactly right. A lot of in person. There's still a lot of conferences, sort of just hitting their the floor and shaking hands, and really making sure that people understand the differences of this option. We're not just trying to sell a lease. This does have some meaningful differences, and hopefully very much in the benefit of those end customers, those building owners. So a lot of more traditional outreach methods there. Though the sort of other two sales channels that I failed to mention earlier is that we are increasingly going direct to building owners. So with that approach, we are starting to experiment a little bit more with sort of digital advertising or other direct outreach approaches.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I mean, I'm doing the same thing with my company. I mean, there are online magazines or blogs or forums that are really geared towards, almost any industry in the world. I mean, there's something for everybody. So you just got to find them and then stick your ads all over it, to get in front of the right people.
Yeah, right. You got to get their attention somehow.
What have been the biggest challenges? I mean, you guys are now, call it 3.5 years into this. What have been the biggest challenges, hurdles, stumbling blocks, whatever you want to call them?
Yeah, there's been a bunch. I think early on, a lot of it was learning about how to actually do that structured finance side. How do you raise the kind of capital that we're talking about? I think our portfolio now is about up to $20 million. So how do you start getting millions of dollars when you're particularly a young team and just starting out? So there was a ton of challenges there. In the earliest days, we even thought we were going to do crowdfunding. We thought we'd do something like Kickstarter, but for energy efficiency, and then quickly realized that wouldn't work, particularly because it would be too much concentrated risk for each individual users, and we didn't want to inadvertently go down that path and end up giving consumers a bad deal. So that was definitely a big challenge and a long learning curve. But now here we are on the other side, getting to work with some of the biggest, most professionalized lenders in the world, and that's been just an incredible learning journey. Otherwise, I think, as is often the case with startups, with a lot of the original founding team, there's a lot of sort of just personal growth. And how do you transition from being, like when I started personally, I was writing our website and doing all the code development. But now haven't gotten to write code in a long time, over a year now. So how do you do that rapid evolution at the personal role level to make sure that you're doing the most and kind of serving the best value for the organization?
What have been the mistakes that you've made, whether it's, product, whether it's pricing, could be hiring? I know you're big on culture, getting the culture is not always easy. So any mistakes or things you wish you could go back and kind of do over again?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing in hindsight that was clear is like, goodness, do I wish that one of our early hires came from a financial background. I mean, Pierre and some of the other founders were, really sharp and had definitely done some of that in their professional experience. But having that as a dedicated role early would have, I think, definitely helped us avoid some extra work. An example there is that, particularly in the first year, the sort of budding dev team and myself ended up proving accounting to ourselves. I don't think we needed to go back through that whole validation system. The rest of the world is there to tell us that accounting is a real system and is really useful.
This is a question I don't think I've actually ever asked before, and I'm not sure why, because I think it's actually pretty relevant. You guys raised a $700,000 seed round. Was that the right amount? Do you wish you had raised more or less looking back?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I think it probably was about right, and it's hard to think about the different realities that may have played out if we had done more or less. I don't think we could have gotten by with less, since there's just so much setup involved in getting a business like this off the ground. There's definitely a high barrier there. But I wonder if having raised more at that point, maybe it would have let us sort of kickstart some of those other things, maybe hire a CFO from the get-go. So that's an interesting question. I would say keep it where it was, or maybe even raise a little bit more.
Then it looks like, according to Crunchbase, once again, you guys raised a larger round, upwards of $7 million later in 2014.
Yeah, our Series A, which is where we got our sort of first more established professionalized investor with VisionRidge, and they've been incredible partners the whole way through.
What were you guys able to prove with the seed round, in terms of traction or milestones that assured those Series A investors that they were making a good investment?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think whereas if I was just kind of doing like a software startup, I think there'd be a lot more sort of traction and historical data that we'd want to show at that point at a Series A. For a business like ours, where, again, establishing a fund and all the complexity involved there, I think a lot of what gave VisionRidge the confidence to come in at that Series A round was the sort of rigor of our systems and modeling. So we had built our own custom in-house underwriting process and model, had gotten that validated by some key outside sources. The advisors that we had brought onto board and gotten their validation, I think, really helped at that stage. But a lot of it was still sort of theoretical, right? We had to do a lot of really deep, hard math to prove out that the model could work at scale. But we, at that point, hadn't had enough time or the infrastructure in place to have the historical business data to show them.
And then you guys raised more money, as we said earlier this year. So between your A round and your B round, it looks like it's a little more than 2 years, which is probably a little bit longer than some startups do it. Some are raising money every 15 to 18 months. So, did you guys just, did you have more cash flow than you expected? Were you a little bit more conservative than you anticipated? Like what was the timing on the Series B?
Yeah, I think one aspect was that we did do a little bit of continual raising on top of that Series A throughout that 2-year period. So we were definitely still bringing in a little bit additional extra to make sure that we had a decent runway underneath ourselves.
Gotcha.
We definitely tried to keep our spend as low as possible, knowing that we didn't quite yet have that kind of volume and revenue to really support ourselves. Again, just how expensive this kind of a business and how much infrastructure is required for it, both on the fund side as well as the Topco business. But I think we were able to sort of prove out a lot in terms of particularly this as a service model. That 2-year stretch was really where we had identified that as being a critical differentiator and a way to really move this market and hopefully meaningfully unlock the ability to get that great technology into buildings.
I would assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it gets a lot easier to recruit and hire after you raise a Series A, and then probably even easier after you raise a Series B. Not just because it's more capital, but because it validates you even more.
Yeah, definitely true. And I think, for anyone joining, particularly for folks with families or other sort of financial obligations, they have to make that risk reward choice. And we've been incredibly fortunate, partly because of the mission alignment and partly because of some of the cool technology and approaches we've been using to get some really excellent talent that really resonate with what we're doing and how we're doing it, in addition to compensation. But they, of course, need to still make that choice of, hey, can I support my family if this is a risky, seed round company? So yeah, once we got to that B, it definitely made it easier, and we continue to be incredibly fortunate with the folks that seem to want to work with us.
So then in terms of culture, because as I've mentioned a couple of times, and you've even alluded to this in some of your other answers, but what does culture mean to you? What does it mean to your co-founder, to the company? How are you guys making sure that you're building the right culture and keeping the right people there?
Yeah, that's a great question and a big one. And I find so many ways to think and talk about it, because it's something that you hear discussed so frequently, particularly in the startup world. But I think often you have more of an opportunity to guide instead of set culture. And I think a lot of it does come right back to hiring. The people that you bring on, particularly early in the company's history, have such a huge impact on what kind of culture you end up with. And again, while particularly as owners and founders, you do have a lot of influence on guiding it, you can't just say by fiat, this is how our culture is going to be. So I think it's always a learning experience. And I've found it really useful to try to stay as humble as possible in my assumptions about what kind of influence or impact I can have that, and try to ask the whole team a lot of questions and try to come to that as much as possible as a group thing. Because I think one of the biggest values of thinking in that sort of approach is it really makes an impact on who else you bring into the organization, right? You sort of starts this trend of the type of folks that want to work with you, and has a huge impact on the sort of day-to-day work product. If folks are happy and healthy, they're going to do a lot better work than if everyone is sort of stressed out and concerned about inner politics or any other things like that.
So in terms of your board construction, like when did you guys start adding board members? Was it just like from the investors that were putting in early capital? I would assume that your A and B investors probably have seats at the table. But then how do you round out the rest of your board?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We've got a Series A and a Series B director from Vision Ridge, and the lead for our Series B was Energy Impact Partners, EIP. So they definitely have seats and are really powerful voices and really help us think through a lot of these critical challenges. The rest of the board is actually one of the original co-founders who's not here full time anymore, but very much a huge supporter and really engaged still, which is Joe Invic. And then Pierres is the other board seat from Sparkfund. So we've kind of got two investors, two Sparkfund, and then the the pivot point is actually an independent. It's Brandon Hurlbut, who is a former chief of staff of the Department of Energy. And he's just so aligned in the broader mission and impact angle that he's been a really wonderful connector and guiding voice in the whole business.
What kind of, in terms of your investors, what kind of value do you try to get out of them? Like, what do you think the role of a good Series A or Series B investor is for a company like Sparkfund?
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought. We've found so much value in those folks. And I think one of the things that's helped the most is just to have that one abstraction removed perspective to really try to challenge us on things. Day to day, we're working so hard on everything that's going on here that sometimes it's easy to lose sight of how it maps into a broader context. And it's easy to get attached to solutions you may have come up with, right? We may have convinced ourselves that, like, yeah, version A is totally the way we want to go. And it's so useful to sort of challenge and bounce that out against someone who's seeing a much broader picture across multiple companies. And on that last point, I think also sort of sharing best practices and knowledge across their portfolios. So our sort of cousins and sister companies within the portfolio has been incredibly valuable, particularly for us as a younger executive team to really learn best practices of how do you manage and best lead and support a growing organization.
So I'm Googling the largest US cities, and obviously New York's at the top, and then Los Angeles. I'm looking for Washington, D.C. There it is at number 21. So, you guys are in D.C. Did you grow up there? Or I know obviously being close to some government agencies probably makes sense, but at what point do you expand to other cities where you have, huge density of potential clients?
Yeah, great question. And actually, we've always sort of started from the thesis of these projects, these opportunities to help businesses get this grid edge tech into their spaces. We've always started from a national perspective there. That may be one thing that, in a kind of to your early question about hindsight, maybe I would have started with more of a focused area, but we sort of tried to bite the bullet, did all the regulatory and compliance and registration to be able to do projects in all the states. So we've always been doing business all over the country.
Okay.
So the geographic location has been more impactful in terms of hiring and support, exactly to your point about advisors and other voices that are often here on policy. So it's been incredibly convenient for folks who are on their way to come visit the White House to stop by and maybe give us some advice from the broader sort of energy and grid edge sort of perspective and patterns that they're seeing evolve.
What area of the country have you guys had the most projects, or the largest amount of projects or largest revenue projects? I mean, I'm not sure how you categorize it, but what's been your biggest market?
Yeah, actually, you did a great job for shuttering, Jonah, because New York and California are definitely two of the big focused areas. California, in part, because they're obviously rolling out a lot of incentives to encourage exactly this kind of equipment getting into spaces.
Right.
And I think New York, similar, because they've also been taking great steps to kind of encourage that sort of thing, but also because there's just a lot of great potential customers in those areas that have building spaces that work out really well for exactly these types of projects.
Do tax credits and lead points ever come into play?
Yeah, great question. For us, not strictly so. There are definitely moments where it intersects, but all of the sort of approach that we've built up doesn't rely at all on any sort of tax credit or other sort of federal or state level incentive program.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I am no expert on lead points or any of that stuff, but I know they're hot button topics, so figured I'd throw it in there. And like you said, California is probably the greenest state out there. I mean, they're certainly, at the forefront of anything that has to do with energy efficiency.
Yeah, and the interesting thing for us is that, while those have certainly been hotspots for us, we've been doing business. I think we've done 42 states now with
Wow.
projects in them. So we're all over the place, and it really doesn't require any interest in energy efficiency or environmental concerns. That's definitely a really nice twofer when we find folks that also care about that. But the economics and convenience and added value of the equipment itself is often compelling enough that folks, even if they aren't thinking in terms of the environment, are compelled to seek out the services we provide.
Awesome. Well, I want to be mindful of your time. I mean, every entrepreneur is, has a million things on their plate. So I want to let you get back to it. A couple last questions here. What is your favorite thing about being an entrepreneur, and what traits do you possess that you think make you a good entrepreneur, or traits that you need to still acquire or improve upon?
Yeah, those are great questions. And I'm sure I could ponder on those more frequently to all of our benefit. I think one of my favorite things is getting to sort of imagine things that might seem crazy at first, and then make a really honest go of making them real, and particularly when those succeed. It's Pierre and I often joke that we're dreaming our own reality in small, specific ways. And it's always exciting to see your efforts have a positive impact on the world around you. And here I am sitting in a new office that we moved into this year, and it's this beautiful space in the sort of Northwest DC. And I get to work with 30 colleagues here in DC that get to enjoy this wonderful space with me. And that's sort of a really nice reminder of how you can sort of dream your own reality. In terms of ways that I think I have characteristics that are well poised for this kind of work, two things that jump to mind that I try to work hard at to maintain are patience and intellectual humility. And that second piece is definitely something we've made an emphasis here at Sparkfund, because I think there's a fair bit of evidence that would support the argument that hubris often does come before the fall and can be definitely the Achilles heel of any budding business.
I totally agree. Yep. I mean, it's the most successful entrepreneurs are usually the ones that understand they don't know everything, and they're either willing to learn it or hire people around them that already know it, and constantly looking to improve themselves. And it sounds like you certainly appreciate that as well.
Yeah, exactly. Well said, Jonah.
Well, thank you so much. Oh no, keep going. I didn't mean to break you.
I guess the last part of your question is what I could do better. And I think very much in line with what you just said, I think probably all of it, but definitely learning how to be a better leader of this size of an organization. Leading 15 people is very different, I'm finding, than leading 45. And I'm excited to keep getting better at making sure that everyone understands what we're trying to do, good channels of communication, and making sure that we can hold on to all the past aspects that made Sparkfund a great place to work and grow that into hopefully a continual place that is a great place to work.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's a good place to close then. Some great advice to end on. In terms of finding you online, certainly the company, I'll put all the website and social media accounts in the post, the blog post, or in the show notes. But you personally, do you do any blogging, or do you have any social media accounts that you want us to connect with?
Me personally, not really that much. I do have a Twitter account that every once in a while I'm active on, usually around conferences and other types of tech things.
Okay.
Definitely try to stay a little bit engaged in things like net neutrality and other sort of hot topics like that.
That is certainly a concern that many of us are focused on right now, for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm curious to see where that heads. It's a little scary to think that the cable providers could be screwing around with their service. So
Yeah, definitely scary, particularly for businesses like us. Like, we very much rely on and being able to have quick access to online platforms. And if that was any way compromised or became more expensive, that would make things extra challenging for us.
agreed. Well, thank you so much, Nikko. Appreciate your time today. Wish you guys the best moving forward, and look forward to staying in touch with you.
Thanks so much, Jonah. Really appreciate it.
You got it, man. Talk to you soon. Bye bye.
Cheers.